A while back I was scrolling through forums late at night, going through World War II history threads, and I came across a comment from a woman explaining her family's story. Her great-grandfather had two brothers. Both of them were half Jewish. Their mother was Jewish, their father was German, under the Nazi racial laws that made them Mischlinge, partial Jews. Both of them fought in the Wehrmacht, as many men in their position did. They served, they fought the battles, they did what soldiers do. One of them survived, and after the war, after Germany was in ruins and Europe had nothing left to offer, he made his way to Israel and fought in the 1948 War of Independence with the IDF. I found that pretty interesting, so I started digging into it. And honestly, the more I looked at it, the more I think this is a far bigger story than most people realise. If I'm being honest, I think there were probably thousands of German Jews who ended up fighting in the IDF. And that's not a stretch when you think about it, because there were tens of thousands of Mischlinge, half-Jewish Germans who served in the Wehrmacht during the war. Many of them hid their backgrounds, many of them were conscripted regardless, many of them fought hard and survived some of the worst battles of the entire conflict. And when the war ended, those men had nowhere obvious to go. Germany was destroyed. Their families in many cases were gone, but they had one thing. They had military experience. And in 1948, the newly declared State of Israel was desperately looking for soldiers. It needed men who knew how to fight. And some of these men went. I think this happened far more than the historical record shows. Most of those stories were never documented. They stayed inside families, in private conversations, in the silence that tends to follow men who fought in two armies and don't fit neatly into either country's history. Before we get to the men, we need to talk about the weapons, because the guns, the planes and the rifles that the IDF used to win the 1948 war were, to a remarkable degree, German, literally German. Built in German factories, stamped with German proof marks, carried by Wehrmacht soldiers across 6 years of war in Europe, and then shipped to the Middle East to fight a completely different war in a completely different cause. That story starts in Czechoslovakia. When Israel declared independence on the 14th of May 1948, it had approximately 600,000 Jewish inhabitants and no functioning military supply chain. The 5 Arab states that invaded within 24 hours of that declaration, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon and Iraq, collectively fielded regular armies with artillery, armoured vehicles, aircraft and naval support. The United States and Britain had both embargoed arms sales to the region. Every major Western power was watching with careful neutrality. Israel had the Haganah, the pre-state paramilitary organisation that had been fighting Arab militias through the Civil War period, and it had whatever weapons those fighters had managed to acquire or manufacture underground. What it did not have was the firepower to survive a conventional war against 5 armies simultaneously. Ben-Gurion understood this with complete clarity. He had been preparing for it for months. His agents had been working through Europe and North America, looking for weapons wherever they could be found, operating through front companies and false manifests and bribed officials, and the one government that was willing to openly deal was one that nobody expected. Czechoslovakia, a Soviet satellite state, barely 3 years out from Nazi occupation, sitting on an enormous stockpile of German military hardware that its factories had been producing until the final weeks of the war. The Czechs needed foreign currency, Israel needed weapons. Stalin, calculating that a Jewish state in the Middle East might lean socialist and counterbalance British influence in the region, gave his approval. The deal was on. What Israel received from Czechoslovakia under Operation Balac was not a collection of surplus odds and ends. It was the backbone of the force that won the 1948 war. 20,000 Czech rifles, Karabiner 98K bolt-action weapons, the standard German infantry rifle of the entire Second World War, the weapon carried by Wehrmacht soldiers from France to Stalingrad. Nearly 3,000 MG-34 general-purpose machine guns, the same weapon that had been the backbone of German squad-level fire superiority since the Spanish Civil War, a gun so capable that it had shaped Allied tactics for 6 years of fighting against it. 27 million rounds of ammunition, 50 Bren light machine guns, anti-tank weapons, artillery pieces, all of it either manufactured in Czech factories during the German occupation or stockpiled from German army stores, all of it, in the strictest sense, German military equipment. And then there were the aircraft. Israel's Air Force in May 1948 consisted of light civilian planes, a handful of smuggled trainers, and effectively nothing capable of engaging military targets or providing close air support. Egypt's Air Force had Spitfires and bombers. Without fighter cover, every Israeli position was exposed to air attack. Ben-Gurion knew that fighters were the critical gap. He needed them immediately. The only fighters available were the ones Czechoslovakia was prepared to sell. The Avia S199 is one of the stranger objects in the history of aviation. The Avia company had spent the war years producing Messerschmitt Bf-109G fighters for the Luftwaffe at its factories in occupied Czechoslovakia. When the war ended, Avia had factory floors full of Bf-109G airframes, tooling and components, everything needed to keep building the plane. The problem was that the original engine, the Daimler-Benz DB605, was no longer available. What they did have in abundance was the Junkers Jumo 211F, the same engine used in the Heinkel He 111 bomber. It was heavier, less powerful, and responded differently to the airframe than the DB605 had. The result was a plane that looked like a Messerschmitt 109, was built like a Messerschmitt 109, and flew nothing like a Messerschmitt 109. Czech pilots called it the Mezek, the mule. Its handling characteristics were, to put it politely, murderous. The engine torque was so severe that it would snap left on takeoff if the pilot wasn't precise. The gun synchronizer was so poorly calibrated that some pilots shot off their own propeller blades in combat. It was viciously difficult to land, because the undercarriage was narrow and the approach characteristics were unforgiving. Israel bought 25 of them at $190,000 each, at a time when a surplus P-51 Mustang was selling in the United States for $4,000. Ben-Gurion paid the price because there was no alternative. He needed fighters. These were the only fighters available, and whatever their faults, they were Messerschmitts. They looked like Messerschmitts. They flew like something that had been built to kill aircraft. Israeli pilots called them Messers, using both the German word for knife and the shorthand for the Messerschmitt, and they flew them. The first 4 Avia S199s arrived in Israel on May 20th, 1948, 6 days after independence and 5 days after the Arab armies crossed the borders. They were assembled in secret at Ekron airfield. Their existence was completely unknown to Egyptian intelligence. On May 29th, an Egyptian column had advanced up the Mediterranean coast and was within 20 miles of Tel Aviv. Israeli engineers had blown a bridge to stop them. The bridge would be repaired by morning. There were no Israeli ground forces capable of stopping the column once it was moving again. 4 Messerschmitts took off from Ekron airfield and attacked. The damage they caused on the ground was minimal, but the Egyptians stopped. Their army had not been told that Israel had fighter planes. Their military planning had not accounted for Israeli air power. The sight of what were recognizably Messerschmitt fighters, aircraft that had defined Luftwaffe air superiority for 6 years, attacking their column was enough to halt the advance. Rudy Ogarten, an American volunteer pilot who had shot down 2 German Messerschmitts over Europe while flying a P-47 Thunderbolt in the Second World War, now flew the Czech version of the same aircraft for the Israeli Air Force. He downed 4 Egyptian planes during the war, achieving ace status across 2 different conflicts with 2 different countries' air forces. The irony of an American pilot who had fought Germany now flying a German aircraft for Israel is the kind of thing that this entire story keeps producing, layers of paradox so thick that they start to feel like the point rather than the coincidence. By the end of the 1948 war, the Avia S199S had 7 confirmed air-to-air kills despite their handling problems, their unreliability, and the fact that no Israeli pilot had flown more than a handful of hours in them before going into combat. Ben-Gurion said it plainly years later. Czech arms saved Israel. Without them, he said, we would not have survived. What he meant specifically was that German arms saved Israel. The Karabiner 98K, the MG-34, the Messerschmitt Bf-109, weapons designed and built for one war, shipped across a continent and fired in another. Israel also received Czechoslovakia's surplus Supermarine Spitfires, 50 of them, in the second phase of the arms deal. The Spitfire is a British aircraft, but the route by which these ones reached Israel is itself a product of the war's aftermath. They were flown out of a former Luftwaffe airfield in Yugoslavia, with the agreement of Tito's government in secret night missions, refueling at improvised stops before reaching Israeli-controlled territory. One of the airfields used as a staging post was a runway the Germans had built during the occupation. The war's infrastructure was being repurposed for a war the people who built it had never imagined. The MG-34 deserves particular attention because of what it represented in 1948. The MG-34 had entered German service in 1936. It had a cyclic rate of fire of up to 900 rounds per minute. It could be used as a light machine gun from a bipod or as a sustained fire weapon on a tripod. It had been the primary German squad weapon in France in North Africa on the Eastern Front, in every theatre where Wehrmacht infantry fought for 6 years. Allied infantry had learned, sometimes fatally, exactly what an MG-34 sounded like. Its distinctive sound was different enough from Allied weapons that experienced veterans could identify it by ear in a firefight. And now those same weapons were in the hands of Israeli infantry, defending settlements in the Negev and the Galilee, against Egyptian, Jordanian and Syrian infantry who were hearing that sound for the first time from the wrong end. One Israeli general described the weapons as arriving still, with their German proof marks stamped on the receivers. The soldiers using them knew exactly what they were and didn't care. What mattered was that they worked. The total scale of the Czech arms deal, when the full accounting is done, is staggering. In addition to the aircraft and machine guns, Israel received Czech-manufactured versions of German artillery pieces, thousands of pistols, anti-tank grenades, and specialist equipment that went directly into Israeli military units that had existed for weeks rather than years. Former Czechoslovak military technicians and instructors travelled to Israel to train the new IDF on the weapons. Some of them spoke German more fluently than Hebrew. The training for Israeli pilots on the Avia S199 was conducted partly in German using Luftwaffe-era manuals by Czech instructors who had themselves learned the aircraft from German documentation. The Israeli Air Force, in its first operational weeks, was in some practical sense a translation of Luftwaffe procedure into a new context, and this is the foundation on which everything else in this story rests. The German weapons came first, the German soldiers came after. To understand who those soldiers were, you need to understand what the war had done to a very specific group of people. Historian Brian Mark Rigg spent most of the 1990s cycling through Germany and Austria, knocking on doors and conducting interviews. What he was looking for was the men the Nazis had called Mischlinge, the partial Jews, the half-Jews and quarter-Jews, the men who fell into the racial categories defined by the Nuremberg laws of 1935. What he found when he compiled his research was a figure that shocked even specialists in the field. Approximately 150,000 men of partial Jewish ancestry had served in the Wehrmacht during the Second World War. Among them were field marshals, generals, admirals and decorated combat officers at every level. Around 20 of them received the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military decoration for battlefield bravery. His book, Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, published by the University Press of Kansas and winner of the William E. Colby Award for Military History, is the foundational work on this subject. Helmut Schmidt, former Chancellor of West Germany, who himself had served as a Luftwaffe officer during the war, endorsed it as essential reading. These men occupied a position that was essentially impossible to describe. The Nazi state had classified them as tainted. Their ancestry made them legally inferior, restricted their rights, and in many cases destroyed their families. But the Wehrmacht needed soldiers, and many, Mischlinge, had been raised as Germans in every cultural sense, with no religious or ethnic identity that connected them to Judaism. They had grown up celebrating Christmas, attending German churches, speaking German as their only language, thinking of themselves as German in every way that mattered. The racial laws didn't change that internal identity, even while stripping them of their legal standing, and so many of them served. Some were conscripted and had no choice. Some volunteered because military service was the one remaining way to demonstrate loyalty and protect their families. Some volunteered because they had grown up in military families and saw no other path. Some, frankly, believed in defending Germany even as Germany was destroying people connected to them by blood. The Wehrmacht's approach to the Mischlinge was, in Rigg's description, erratic, ambivalent and contradictory. An order in April 1940 required all half-Jews to be discharged from military service. Many commanding officers simply ignored it because they needed their most experienced men. A system of exemptions allowed individuals to apply directly to Hitler for permission to continue serving, and Hitler personally signed hundreds of these exemption orders, spending time reviewing individual cases even in the middle of operational crises. By 1944, as Germany's manpower crisis became catastrophic, there were proposals to conscript all remaining Mischlinge regardless of previous policy. The war's final months saw men who had been discharged in 1940 spent years in labour camps and watched their families destroyed by the state they had served, being called back into uniform to defend cities that were already burning. The experience of these men in combat was not marginal. They fought in the same battles as everyone else. They were at Moscow, at Stalingrad, in North Africa, at Kursk, in Normandy. They won the same decorations, suffered the same casualties, endured the same conditions. Werner Goldberg, a half-Jewish soldier whose photograph appeared in a Nazi recruitment advertisement in 1939 with the caption "The Ideal German Soldier," participated in the invasion of Poland. Erhard Milch, whose Jewish ancestry was an open secret in the upper reaches of the Luftwaffe, rose to field marshal rank and oversaw the Air Force's industrial production. Goering, when told about Milch's background, is supposed to have said that he would decide who was a Jew in the Luftwaffe. These were not hidden figures operating in the margins. They were central to the German military effort at every level. What matters for this story is what happened to those men after 1945. Many of them came out of the war with combat experience spanning years and multiple fronts. They had fought in France, in North Africa, in the Balkans, on the Eastern Front. Some of them had survived the worst campaigns of the entire war: the retreat from Moscow, the fighting at Stalingrad, the endless grinding attrition of the Eastern Front through 1943 and 1944. They had the specific kind of toughness that only comes from extended frontline service in conditions that killed most of the men around you, and when the war ended, they found themselves in a Germany that had no place for them and no interest in their story. The new West German state was not eager to discuss the complexity of what had happened to men of mixed heritage under Nazi rule. The Jewish community in many cases was not welcoming to men who had worn Wehrmacht uniforms, and with reason. They had served a state that had murdered millions. These men existed in a post-war no-man's land as defined as the one they had navigated during the war itself. Some of them made a decision that nobody has ever fully counted or documented. They went to Israel. The path was not straightforward. After 1945, the primary migration route toward Palestine ran through the displaced persons camps, the enormous refugee networks scattered across Germany, Austria and Italy, housing the survivors of the war's destruction who had nowhere else to go. The Bricha movement, organised by the Haganah and later by the Jewish Agency, was moving people through these camps and toward the Mediterranean ports where ships were waiting to run the British naval blockade. The movement operated with significant informality. Identities were fluid, documentation was improvised, and the organisers were focused on getting people to Palestine rather than verifying the details of their backgrounds. A man who spoke German as his first language, whose mother had been Jewish, who presented himself as a survivor of the Nazi years, which in the most literal sense he was, could move through this system without his Wehrmacht service being the first question anyone asked. Heinz Meyer is documented in Riggs research, and his story is the clearest single example of what I'm describing. Meyer had served in the Wehrmacht. His father was Jewish, which under Nazi racial law made him a Mischlinger of the first degree, a half-Jew, subject to the full weight of the racial classification system. He had fought in the war. He had survived. And after it was over, he made his way to the newly declared State of Israel, enlisted in the IDF, and rose through the ranks to the rank of Major. He served in the 1948 War of Independence, fighting in an army that was using the same German weapons he would have been trained on as a Wehrmacht soldier. But here is the detail that I think tells you everything about the strange position these men occupied. When the Israeli authorities looked at Meyer's background, they told him he was not Jewish. Under Jewish religious law, Judaism passes through the mother. His mother was not Jewish, his father was. So to the Nazis, he had been a Jew, persecuted and classified for 12 years on the basis of his father's ancestry. And to the Israeli state, he was a Gentile ineligible for the religious recognition that would have made him a full member of the community he was fighting to build. He could carry a rifle for Israel, he could die for Israel, he could rise to the rank of Major in the IDF. But officially, institutionally, he belonged to neither world. The Nazis had called him a Jew, the Israelis called him a Goy. He had fought for both countries and been claimed by neither, and I think about that story a lot when I think about what this video is actually about, because the standard narratives of the Second World War and the founding of Israel are both built around clarity: a clear enemy, a clear victim, a clear hero, a clear founding story. And men like Meyer don't fit into any of those narratives. They're too complicated. They fought for the wrong side first. Their ancestry was wrong in two different directions depending on which legal framework you applied to them, and so the historical record mostly leaves them out. There was almost certainly not one Heinz Meyer. There were many men with his story, or versions of it, who served in the IDF, and whose service was never formally recorded as what it actually was. Former Wehrmacht soldiers, men who had fought for Germany now fighting for Israel. Then there is Ulrich Schnaft, whose story is documented in recently declassified Shin Bet files and is, if anything, even more remarkable. Schnaft was born on October 3rd, 1923 in Königsberg, East Prussia, the city that is now Kaliningrad, Russian territory since 1945. He was illegitimate, placed in a state orphanage by his mother, and adopted by a working-class German family. He grew up in Nazi Germany, attended a vocational school, and trained as a mechanical technician. In 1941, at 18 years old, he volunteered for the Waffen SS. He served on the Eastern Front. He was wounded and sent back to Germany to recover. After recuperating, he was transferred to Yugoslavia, then to northern Italy. In late 1944, as Allied forces advanced through Italy, Schnaft was captured by the US Army near the Po River and spent the remainder of the war in an Allied prisoner of war camp. What happened next is where his story becomes something that sounds like it was invented for a film, but is completely documented. In 1947, Schnaft was released from the POW camp into a Germany that had nothing to offer him. Cities were rubble, the economy had collapsed. He had no family, no property, no prospects. He was a 23-year-old former Waffen-SS soldier in a country that was trying to process what the Waffen-SS had been. While drifting through Munich, he noticed something specific. Jewish displaced persons, survivors making their way through Europe toward Palestine, were receiving food parcels and financial support from American and international relief agencies. He was destitute, they were surviving. Schnaft made a decision. He told people his father had been Jewish and that he was a survivor from Poland. He made contact with the groups organizing what was called Aliyah Bet, the illegal immigration movement smuggling Jewish refugees into British-controlled Palestine past the Royal Navy blockade. He trekked to Marseille, joined a group of Holocaust survivors and boarded a ship bound for Palestine. The British intercepted it. Schnaft and the other passengers were sent to an internment camp on Cyprus, where the British were holding Jewish refugees who had attempted to reach Palestine illegally. Inside the camp, Schnaft had nothing to do for months except learn Hebrew and build his cover identity. He joined a Haganah cell operating inside the camp. He helped plan escape attempts. By the time the camp closed following Israeli independence in 1948 and the remaining inmates were released to Israel, Schnaft had spent more than a year building a new identity from the ground up. He arrived in Haifa as Gavriel Zusman, a Jewish refugee from Poland, and was placed on a kibbutz west of Jerusalem to learn farming and improve his Hebrew. In August 1949, Schnaft, as Zusman, was drafted into the Israel Defense Forces. The IDF in those early years was, as one account described it, a patchwork of refugees and militia veterans. Background checks were cursory, few people had verifiable paperwork. Schnaft completed a squad commander's course. He was described by his instructors as capable, disciplined and an effective teacher, qualities that were, if anything, a direct product of his Waffen-SS training. He was known for his ability to teach others how to handle weapons, how to maintain equipment, how to function under pressure. He volunteered for the artillery corps. He rose quickly to the rank of lieutenant. He joined Mapai, the ruling political party of David Ben-Gurion. He appeared by every available measure to have integrated completely into Israeli society. His commanders liked him. His colleagues respected him. He seemed to be exactly what he presented himself as. By 1952, he was seeking a permanent commission, a career officer post, that required a more thorough security review than his initial service had involved. That review was where things began to unravel. Military intelligence investigators started a standard background inquiry. The officer calling himself Zusman had no living relatives, no verifiable history before 1947, and spoke Hebrew fluently, but with a distinctive German accent that was noticeably different from the accents of other European Jewish immigrants. One report noted that he had been seen drunk, showing fellow soldiers a photograph of himself in what appeared to be a German military uniform. When asked about it, Schnaft said it was a costume. Shin Bet had him flagged. By 1954, aware that something was closing around him, Schnaft left Israel. He and the woman he had been living with sailed to Genoa, intending to travel on to Germany. At the border, his Israeli passport, stamped not valid for travel to Germany due to Israel's diplomatic boycott, was refused. His companion, who still held a German passport, crossed alone. Schnaft was left in Genoa with $20 in his pocket and an Israeli passport he couldn't use to enter the only country he'd been born in. He walked into the Egyptian consulate. What Schnaft offered the Egyptians was everything he had learned as an IDF artillery corps officer: detailed descriptions of unit structures, bases, armaments, training programs, and the names of senior officers. The Egyptians flew him to Cairo, gave him the false identity of Robert Hayat, debriefed him for a month, and eventually arranged travel documents that allowed him to reach Germany. He returned to Frankfurt in early 1954 with several $100s and the knowledge that he had sold Israeli military secrets to the country's principal enemy. What he did not know was that the woman he had confided in, the one whose husband he had been having an affair with, had told her husband the truth. The husband wrote to Shin Bet with a photograph. Israeli intelligence confirmed the identification. The debate inside the intelligence community was brief. An assassination squad was proposed and rejected. The decision was made to bring Schnaft back to Israel alive, to put him on trial, and to demonstrate that Israeli intelligence could reach anywhere in the world. A Mossad operative named Shmuel Moriah, who was of Iraqi Jewish background and spoke Arabic and German fluently, was sent to Frankfurt. He made contact with Schnaft at a social gathering, told him he had also served in the Waffen-SS, and established a connection over shared history. Weeks later, posing as an Iraqi intelligence officer named Captain Adnan bin Adnan, Moriah met Schnaft for lunch in a quiet Frankfurt restaurant. Schnaft believed he was being recruited by Iraqi intelligence for further work against Israel. He was instead being walked back to a trial. He was lured to Israel, arrested, tried and convicted. He served 5 years before being released and returning to Germany. He died in 2013, aged 89. The Shin Bet files on the Schnaft case were only partially declassified in recent years. Portions remain redacted. Israeli intelligence described him as an opportunistic, daring and sometimes foolhardy man with a specific talent for adapting to ideologically driven societies and using them for his own goals and survival. What is not in the files, because there is no legal framework to put it in, is the full reality of what Schnaft was. He was a Waffen-SS veteran who had fought on the Eastern Front and in the Balkans, had infiltrated the IDF under a false identity, had risen to officer rank, and had served in that army for 3 years. The IDF was not looking for men like him, but in the chaos of the early state, with its desperate need for soldiers and its cursory background checks, men like him found a way in. The broader context for all of this is the Gachal, the acronym for the Hebrew Giyus Hutz La'aretz, which means overseas recruitment. It was the formal IDF program that recruited Jewish volunteers from outside Israel during the 1948 war. Approximately 23,000 people came through Gachal, the majority of them recruited from the displaced persons camps in Germany, Austria and Italy, the refugee networks scattered across Europe in the aftermath of the war. These were people who had survived the years of Nazi rule in one form or another and were now making their way to the new state. Gachal recruits accounted for approximately a quarter of total IDF manpower and an estimated 1/3 of frontline fighters during the 1948 war. They were disproportionately important in the infantry units that did the hardest fighting. The 1948 war was not a minor conflict. It was an existential struggle fought simultaneously on multiple fronts against 5 Arab armies, and it produced battles that were as brutal as anything that had happened in Europe 3 years earlier. At closer range, on smaller scales, with less equipment on both sides, but with the same absolute stakes. The Battle of Latrun, where Israeli forces attempted 3 times to capture a fortified police station commanding the main road to besiege Jerusalem, and were thrown back each time with heavy casualties. Operation Nakshon, the drive to break the Arab blockade of Jerusalem, fought through the Judean hills against well-positioned Arab irregular forces. Operation Yoav in October 1948, which drove the Egyptian army out of the Negev desert through a combination of airstrikes, armoured thrusts, and infantry assaults that destroyed 2 Egyptian brigades in 2 weeks. These were operations conducted by an army that had been in existence for months, using weapons that had arrived by ship from Czechoslovakia only weeks before the fighting started, led by officers who, in many cases, had been militia commanders with no conventional military experience, filled out by soldiers recruited from European refugee camps, whose backgrounds nobody had closely examined. The men who went through Gachal and emerged as IDF infantry in those battles included, somewhere in their number, veterans of the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS who had crossed the Mediterranean and arrived in a new country. Some of them had fought at Stalingrad, some of them had fought in Normandy, some of them had held the Eastern Front through the catastrophic German retreats of 1943 and 1944, and now they were in the Negev, or the Galilee, or the Jerusalem corridor, carrying German rifles, firing German machine guns against Arab armies that were also, in many cases, using captured German weapons and being advised by former German officers who had taken service with Egypt and Syria after 1945. The German weapons were on both sides of the 1948 war. The German military experience was on both sides of the 1948 war. The post-war careers of men who had served the Third Reich led in multiple directions, some to Israel, some to Egypt, some to the French Foreign Legion in Indochina, some to the intelligence services of the Western powers, some to quiet lives in South American countries that had not asked too many questions. What the war produced on the human level was not clarity, but dispersal. Men scattered to every corner of the post-war world, taking their skills and their experience with them, and deploying them in conflicts that bore no obvious relation to the one they had originally been trained to fight. There is also the Mahal, the overseas volunteers who came as individual fighters rather than through the displacement network. Approximately 4,400 Mahal volunteers came from 58 countries. Most were Jewish, from Britain, the United States, Canada, and South Africa. Most had served in Allied armies during the Second World War. The Mahal made a disproportionate contribution to the Israeli Air Force. At certain points during the 1948 war, English was more commonly spoken than Hebrew in IAF operational communications, simply because so many of the pilots and ground crew were Americans, Canadians, South Africans, and British who had learned their trade in Allied service and arrived in Israel with skills the nascent Air Force could not have developed from scratch. Ben-Gurion described the Mahal's contribution as qualitative rather than quantitative, not decisive in terms of numbers, but decisive in terms of capability. Among the most notable individual Mahal volunteers was David Mickey Marcus, a Jewish-American colonel who had served on Eisenhower's staff during the European campaign and attended the Allied conferences at Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam. The Jewish agency recruited him in late 1947. He wrote training manuals for the Haganah, formulated small unit tactics for the desert fighting against the Egyptian army, and supervised the construction of the Burma Road, the bypass route around Arab positions that broke the siege of Jerusalem in May 1948 and saved the city's Jewish population from surrender. In May 1948, the IDF made Marcus a general, the first person to hold that rank in a Jewish army in almost 2,000 years. He was killed by accident 3 weeks later, shot by an Israeli sentry who did not recognize him in the dark outside his headquarters. He is buried at West Point. The Mahal also included documented, though rarely discussed, men of German background with German military experience whose paths to Israel were complicated enough that the histories don't dwell on them. Gordon Levitt, a non-Jewish British pilot recruited by Haganah agents in Europe in early 1948, described his initial reception with some humour. His recruiters told him frankly that they were convinced he was a British spy, but were going to take him along to see what he was up to. Levitt flew the Avia S199 on supply missions, ferrying the Messerschmitts from Czechoslovakia to Israel in night flights, navigating without instruments across hundreds of miles of European airspace that was theoretically closed to Israeli aircraft. He was one of many non-Jewish volunteers for whom the founding of Israel was not a specifically Jewish cause, but a more general one, an anti-colonial struggle, a response to the specific injustice of statelessness, or simply the kind of war that attracted men who had been through one war and found that peace didn't suit them. The Mahal volunteers brought something the IDF desperately needed beyond their individual combat skills. They brought organisational knowledge, they brought training methods, they brought the specific institutional understanding of how a modern military actually functions, how you run an artillery battery, how you maintain armoured vehicles in the field, how you coordinate air and ground operations. Many of the IDF's foundational procedures in those early years were essentially translated from Allied or German military doctrine by men who had learned them in European armies. The Israeli Air Force conducted its early operations using procedures its pilots had learned flying for the RAF, the USAAF, and, in the case of the Messerschmitt training program, procedures that traced back directly to Luftwaffe documentation. The irony was total and nobody had time to think about it. There was a war on, the procedures worked, that was what mattered. And then there is Otto Skorzeny, which is a story that belongs to a different decade, but that is, in its way, the most extraordinary chapter in this entire history. By the early 1960s, Israel had been a functioning state for 15 years. It had fought and won the 1948 war, the 1956 Suez Crisis, and was preparing for further conflicts it could see approaching. But one of the most pressing security concerns of that period was not a military threat in the conventional sense. It was a group of German scientists, dozens of former Nazi rocket engineers, men who had worked on the V2 program, men who had helped build the weapons that devastated London and Antwerp, had been hired by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser to develop a ballistic missile program. Factory 333, as the program was known, was designed to produce surface-to-surface missiles capable of reaching Tel Aviv. Documents obtained by the Mossad indicated that at least some of the missiles were intended to carry unconventional warheads, radioactive material, chemical agents. The German scientists building these weapons for an Arab state that had just fought a war against Israel were, in the view of Israeli intelligence chief Issa Harel, an existential threat. Harel launched Operation Damocles, a campaign of letter bombs, threatening phone calls, and targeted assassinations designed to drive the German scientists out of Egypt. And then one of his operatives reported a contact that complicated the operation in a remarkable way. One of the men connected to the Factory 333 program had a link to Otto Skorzeny. Skorzeny is worth explaining for anyone who doesn't know the name, because he was genuinely one of the most famous soldiers in the German military during the Second World War. An Austrian by birth, he had risen through the Waffen-SS to command Germany's Special Operations Forces. In September 1943, he led the raid that rescued Benito Mussolini from a mountaintop prison in the Apennines, a glider assault on a fortified position that extracted the Italian dictator from the custody of the new Italian government within hours of his capture. Hitler awarded him the Knight's Cross for it personally. He subsequently led Operation Greif in the Ardennes in December 1944, infiltrating English-speaking German soldiers dressed in American uniforms behind Allied lines during the Battle of the Bulge. The operation created chaos out of all proportion to its military effect and earned Skorzeny a reputation as the most dangerous man in Europe, a label that followed him through his post-war career in Spain, where he had settled as a successful businessman. By the early 1960s, Skorzeny was on Simon Wiesenthal's list of war crimes suspects. He was also connected to virtually every former SS officer operating in the post-war European underworld, the networks that had helped Nazis escape to South America, the organizations that maintained connections between the old guard, and he was in contact with at least some of the German scientists working for NASA's rocket program. Mossad chief Harel decided to recruit him. The approach was made through an intermediary. The hook, the thing Skorzeny wanted, was to be removed from Wiesenthal's war crimes list. Skorzeny had not been convicted of war crimes and did not consider himself guilty of any. Being on that list meant he was a potential target for assassination, which was not an abstract concern for a former SS officer living in post-war Europe. He wanted the list entry removed. Harel agreed. He then approached Wiesenthal and asked him to remove Skorzeny from the list. Wiesenthal refused categorically. The Mossad forged a letter from Wiesenthal confirming the removal and gave it to Skorzeny. Skorzeny flew to Israel. He underwent briefings at Mossad facilities. He was taken to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial and Museum. He showed no visible sign of remorse or guilt. The Mossad's psychological analysts concluded he had no moral compass in any conventional sense, but would operate effectively as an asset for practical reasons, the life insurance the operation provided, and what appeared to be genuine excitement at being involved in clandestine work again. He returned to Europe and began delivering. He flew to Egypt and compiled a detailed list of every German scientist working at Factory 333, their names, addresses, family members, and connections. He provided the names of European front companies that were procuring and shipping components for the missile program. He mailed at least one letter bomb, and he participated in at least one assassination. The killing of Heinz Krug, a Munich-based businessman whose company was a primary procurement front for Factory 333. Krug vanished in September 1962 and was never found. According to Israeli journalists Yossi Melman and Dan Raviv, who had access to Mossad archives, Skorzeny pulled the trigger. Yosef Ranan, the Mossad officer who managed Skorzeny, had lost his mother and brother in the Holocaust. He was a man who had more personal reason than almost anyone to despise Otto Skorzeny and everything he represented. He managed him anyway because the threat the German scientists posed to Israel was real, and Skorzeny's access to those scientists was real, and in the world of intelligence the question of what a man has done is always secondary to the question of what he can do now. When Skorzeny died in Madrid in 1975, former SS officers gathered at his funeral ceremony in Vienna and gave the Hitler salute over his coffin. One other man was present that day. Yosef Ranan, retired, had flown to the ceremony at his own expense to pay his respects to his former agent. He said nothing publicly about why he was there. Operation Damocles ended not because it succeeded completely, but because Ben-Gurion, under pressure from Foreign Minister Golda Meir, who was carefully building the West German-Israeli relationship, ordered Harel to stand down. The diplomatic relationship with West Germany, and with it access to covert arms supplies and financial support, was worth more than the elimination of the Factory 333 program. Harel resigned over the decision. By the end of 1963, most of the German scientists had left Egypt anyway, driven out by a combination of Israeli pressure and the realities of working for NASA's chaotic procurement system. What does all of this add up to? I think it adds up to a story about what war actually does to people and to categories. The Second World War produced a very specific kind of human outcome, men who didn't fit the boxes that the post-war world wanted to put them in, the Mischlinger who had fought for Germany and then fought for Israel, the Waffen-SS veteran who rose to IDF officer, the former Nazi commando who became a Mossad assassin. These aren't edge cases or anomalies, they're what happens when a war that kills tens of millions of people over 6 years creates an aftermath that nobody had planned for. The weapons tell the same story in a more concrete way. The Karabiner 98K was designed in Germany, produced in German factories, carried by German soldiers across the whole of occupied Europe. It ended up in the hands of Israeli infantry defending the Galilee against Syrian troops, who were also using captured German weapons. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, the primary German fighter of the entire war, flew its last combat missions with the Star of David painted on its fuselage. The MG-34 that had cut down Soviet infantry on the Eastern Front was used to defend kibbutzim in the Negev. These are not metaphors. These are things that actually happened, documented in photographs and official inventories and the memoirs of the men who were there. Ben-Gurion understood what he was doing when he made the deal with Czechoslovakia. He understood that he was building a Jewish state with the weapons of the regime that had tried to destroy the Jewish people. He is on record as saying plainly that Czech arms, German arms, saved Israel. He was not embarrassed by this. He was a practical man in an impossible situation, and practical men take what is available. The soldiers are less documented. The Karl-Heinz Meyers and the Ulrich Schnafts are in the historical record partly by accident. Meyer because Rig happened to find him while cycling through Germany collecting interviews, Schnaft because his spy case produced declassified intelligence files. The men who went through Gachal, who moved through the displaced persons camps and into the IDF, without anyone recording their Wehrmacht service, are not in the record at all. They are in family stories like the one that started this video. The woman's comment on a forum late at night describing her grandfather's brother who had fought for Germany and then fought for Israel, and whose story had never been part of any official history. I think that story is more common than we know. I think there are hundreds of versions of it that were never written down, and I think the reason they were never written down is not because they weren't real, but because neither Germany nor Israel had any language for what those men were. They didn't fit the story either country wanted to tell about itself. The weapons were easier to acknowledge. You can photograph a Messerschmitt with a Star of David on its fuselage. You can photograph Israeli soldiers carrying K9-8 rifles with German proof marks. You can put those images in a history book and call them a curiosity, an irony, an unexpected consequence of the war. The men are harder. The men require you to look at the war as something that scrambled every category it touched: loyalty, identity, nationality, enemy, ally, and left behind a generation of people who had learned only one skill and had to find somewhere to use it. Some of them found Israel. Some of them found the French Foreign Legion in Vietnam. Some of them found Nasser's Egypt, training the same Arab armies the IDF was fighting. The categories of the Cold War world could not contain what the Second World War had produced. And so most of those stories stayed in families, in private conversations, in comments on forums late at night from women describing their great-grandfather's brothers, until someone started digging and found that this was a far bigger story than anyone had thought. That is what this video has been about. The German weapons that won the 1948 war, the German soldiers who fought in the army that used them, and the specific silence that has surrounded both for 75 years. Because the story doesn't fit cleanly into the history that anyone was trying to tell.